A cool autumn night in early September carried a soft, late summer breeze across Lake Michigan. The members of Milwaukee's Union Guard stood near the beautiful, luxurious paddle wheel steamship, enjoying the night breeze and maybe a quick cigar before boarding their ship. The presidential election was coming up, and they were in staunch support of Stephen A. Douglas, the man running against none other than Abraham Lincoln. Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for our younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. I do have one quick announcement for you guys. If you didn't know already, we are launching YouTube memberships. There will be 3 tiers with benefits for each tier, so don't hesitate to check it out. For all of our lovely patrons, thank you so much for your continued support. Patreon will stay live for anyone who would like to stay subscribed, but I highly recommend switching to YouTube memberships to take advantage of the perks. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's move on with the story. This week we cover Lady Elgin, the greatest loss of life on open water in the history of the Great Lakes. Before we get into the devastation, we need to look at the beginning of her career. She was built in 1851 in Buffalo, New York by Bidwell and Banta, costing $95,000. In 2024, given inflation, that would be $3,868,450. She was owned and operated by an American fur trader, insurance underwriter, and land speculator named Gurdon Saltonstall Hubbard, and he'd named the gorgeous vessel after Lord Elgin, Canada's Governor-General from 1847 to 1854. We don't have exact dates of when she was laid down, built, and launched, but we know she was completed sometime in 1851. Before we get further into her story, let's take a look at her specs. PS Lady Elgin was a sidewheel steamship, also called a paddle wheel steamship, and she was designed to ferry passengers and package freight across the Great Lakes. Her gross tonnage was 1,037.70, her hull being built entirely of wood. She was 252 feet long, had a beam of 32.66 feet wide, and a height of 13 feet tall. In the 1850s, wooden-hulled paddle wheel steamships were one of the most elegantly appointed passenger ships servicing the Great Lakes area, as she'd be designated a first-class steamer and was a favorite among the traveling public. Early on in her career, her route was between Buffalo, New York, and Chicago, Illinois. To get between these two places, she'd have to travel from Chicago through Lake Michigan, then through the Straits of Mackinac into Lake Huron. After this, it would be through the St. Clair River, Lake St. Clair, and the Detroit River leading into Lake Erie, finally pulling into Buffalo on the other side of Lake Erie. That's a long, windy trip, especially in an 1850s-era wooden sidewheeler. Her later route would be from Chicago to Collingwood, Ontario, Canada, cutting out Lake Erie from the trip, and instead she'd cross Lake Huron into the Georgian Bay. In the latest part of her career, she'd take a route from Chicago to other Lake Michigan ports and on into Lake Superior. However, her career wasn't all Great Lakes fun and fine dining. She was involved in several accidents, including one where she sank. Her first accident was in 1854, and she struck a rock at Manitowoc, Wisconsin, sinking and being refloated and repaired shortly after that. In 1855, there was an accident involving some of her machinery, and she was towed back to Chicago for repairs. In 1857, a fire broke out aboard the ship, and the fire damage needed to be repaired. In June of 1858, she struck a reef at Copper Harbor, Michigan, needing to be towed and repaired. Later that year, in August of 1858, she ran aground and was stranded on Aux Sable Point Reef in Lake Superior. A year would pass, and in October of 1859, her crossbeam snapped in half and she was towed to Marquette, Michigan for repairs. The following month in November of 1859, her crank pin broke near Point Iroquois, Michigan, and she was towed to safety yet again, and that leads us up to 1860 and her final voyage. The Lady Elgin was incredibly accident-prone, and we are prone to loving ships. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comments section below. Alright, time to get more into the time period, the final voyage, and the sinking. Let's get some context for everything going on. I can tell you that it's 1860 and that's good and well, but it's helpful if you know some of the historical events taking place. During this time, the heat was on and the nation was beginning to divide, preparing for the American Civil War, which would take place from 1861 to 1865. Settlers were still traveling via the Oregon Trail in covered wagons to a better life in the West, and the economy was becoming more industrialized, with more Americans than ever choosing to live in big cities. The California Gold Rush had just finished 5 years earlier, the Pony Express began in 1860, and unfortunately, slavery was the norm for a large portion of the United States. This is the world that PS Lady Elgin was immersed in, and late in 1860 is when her career would end. Lady Elgin left Milwaukee, Wisconsin on the night of September 6, 1860, from the Dooley, Martin, Dewsman and Company dock, laden with members of Milwaukee's Union Guard. They were heading to Chicago to hear a campaign speech by Stephen A. Douglas, Abraham Lincoln's opponent, but there's no clear historical evidence that Douglas actually made his appearance in Chicago. Nevertheless, they were in Chicago by the following morning, and 300 men and women spent the day on September 7th listening to political speeches, followed by an evening of entertaining aboard the PS Lady Elgin. That night, they were regaled by a German brass band on board. It was a night of music, chatting, laughing, dancing, and drinking as they set forth on the return trip to Milwaukee. Lake Michigan was beginning to experience a storm, with worsening waves and gale-force winds whipping across the lake. Lady Elgin was making progress on the stormy lake, a bright spot in the darkness as she was brightly lit with all of her deck lights for safety. Meanwhile, in the darkness, another ship was in play. The schooner, Augusta of Oswego, was struggling in the heavy gale with only one single white light alit, mounted on a 5-foot Samson on the bow. There was no way PS Lady Elgin's crew would be able to spot this in the darkness. Augusta either did not attempt to, or was unable to turn away and avoid what happened next. At 2:30 a.m. on the morning of August 8, 1860, Augusta of Oswego rammed into the port side of the Lady Elgin, damaging Augusta's bowsprit and headgear, and tearing a massive hole into the port side of Lady Elgin below the waterline. The two ships broke apart from the collision shortly after, with Lady Elgin pressing on, being pushed forward by her steam engine. The crew of Augusta, believing the Lady Elgin had gotten away safely and that their own ship was badly damaged, decided to make a beeline for Chicago. This was in the ages before Marconi wireless systems, and so there was no way for the ships to stay in contact with one another. As for Lady Elgin, passengers and crew would have heard a loud crash, and the ship would have shuddered and been knocked ajar by the impact, probably waking some of them and others not. For my younger audience members and animal lovers, I do apologize for this next bit of information I have to share with you, as it might be a little bit upsetting. Captain Wilson of the Lady Elgin immediately ordered that all cargo and cattle be thrown overboard to lighten the load and raise the gaping hole in Lady Elgin's port side above the waterline. Meanwhile, the steward was down in the coal bunker with mattresses trying to plug up the gaping hole in the side of the ship and stop the flooding. Captain Wilson then ordered a lifeboat lowered on the starboard side to check the extent of the damage done to Lady Elgin, but unfortunately, the lifeboat was left in the dust. This is crucial, because this is before the sinking of Titanic, and therefore, there are not enough lifeboats for everyone on board. She was only 10 miles from shore, so tantalizingly close, yet so far. Thunder, rainfall, and lightning illuminated the chaotic scene that began to unfold, and within 20 minutes of the collision, Lady Elgin broke apart, with all but the bow section sinking at a rapid rate. Scattered wreckage littered the lake. All of the life preservers and the hardwood planks that were 5 feet long and 18 inches wide were never used during the sinking. 2 lifeboats with a grand total of 18 people aboard made it to shore. Charles Beverung, the drummer of the German brass band, saved himself by using his large bass drum as a life preserver. 14 others were saved on a large raft, and many others were scooped up while clinging to the wreckage. 98 in total were saved, with over 300 succumbing to the sinking. Some went down with the ship, some drowned in the middle of the lake as it was uncommon for most people to know how to swim at the time, and others were swept toward the shore only to be drowned by breakers within a few hundred feet of shore. Survivors would go on to report the heroic efforts of Captain Wilson as he attempted to save 300 persons collected on a makeshift raft. When the sun rose up into the sky, between 350 and 400 passengers and crew were set adrift in stormy waters, clinging to whatever they could for as long as they could. Many made it close to shore only to find that breakers were not so kind, dragging them under and drowning them. Students from Garrett Biblical Institute and Northwestern University were watching the shore on the morning of August 8, 1860, searching for survivors. Word had spread once Augusta of Oswego had made it to Chicago. Edward Spencer, one of these students, is credited with saving 17 people over the course of 6 hours, sustaining such life-altering injuries that he was disabled for the rest of his life. A plaque in his honor was first placed in the Northwestern University Gymnasium and is now in the Northwestern University Library. Hats off to him. He made an enormous sacrifice to save the lives of others. In the course of the sinking, an estimated 300 people died, and this included Captain Wilson, who died trying to save 2 women when the surf took him and slammed him into the rocks near shore, knocking him unconscious and unable to save himself. Most of the victims were from Milwaukee, and a majority of them were Irish, including nearly all of Milwaukee's Irish Union Guard. So many Irish-American political operatives perished in the sinking that the disaster has been credited with transferring the balance of political power in Milwaukee, quote, from the Irish to the Germans, which is significant since the Irish wanted Stephen A. Douglas to become president and the Germans wanted Abraham Lincoln, the man who would go on to abolish slavery and lead us through the Civil War, reuniting a fractured nation. The old wives' tale or generationally passed down rumor of the sinking is that over 1,000 children were orphaned because of the sinking of Lady Elgin. However, researchers have disproven that, and the records show that fewer than 40 children were orphaned. Still, that's nothing to sneeze at. Almost 40 children lost both their mother and father, with many others losing at least one of their parents. According to Great Lakes historian J.B. Mansfield in 1899, Lady Elgin's sinking was, quote, one of the greatest marine horrors on record, and he's still not wrong. The sinking of the Lady Elgin remains the worst loss of life on open water in the history of the Great Lakes to this day. The sinking of the Lady Elgin was an enormous tragedy, and our YouTube members and patrons help us honor her legacy. This episode couldn't be possible without our amazing YouTube members and patrons. Thank you all so much. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Enough of that. Now it's time to look at the legal obligations and the wreck itself. After the sinking of PS Lady Elgin, her owner, Gurdon Saltonstall Hubbard, received a $12,000 insurance payment for the loss of the ship. However, neither he nor the insurance company accepted abandonment of the Lady Elgin. The captain of Augusta of Oswego, Darius Mallet, was arrested and tried in Chicago for navigational negligence, but he was ultimately found not guilty. His second mate, however, would not be so lucky. A coroner's jury declared Mr. Budge, the second mate, and his crew to hold the lion's share of the blame. 4 years after the tragedy, a new rule was put in place that required all sailing ships to carry running lights, since it was determined by Professor Mason and Lieutenant Bartlett that the primary cause of the collision was the lack of a $15 lantern on the Augusta. Steamboat historian Peter Charlebois noted that after the investigation, Captain Mallet and Lady Elgin's crew and owners were all absolved of any blame. He reported the following. Quote, the judgment was based on a law that not only gave sail the right-of-way over steam, but did not require sailing vessels to carry running lights. Apparently, Augusta had sighted the passenger steamer 20 minutes before the collision, but in the rain had misjudged the distance between them. 4 years after the disaster in 1864, a new ruling was made requiring sailing vessels to carry running lights. Since there were still nearly 1,900 ships under sail by 1870, the regulations were long overdue. As for the wreck of PS Lady Elgin, she remained alone and unearthed for 139 years, being discovered in 1989 off Highwood, Illinois by Harry Zeich. Zeich was then awarded ownership of the wreck in 1999 after a protracted legal fight. The wreck consists of 4 main debris fields lying in 50 and 60 feet of water, having been stripped of artifacts over the years. The Underwater Archaeological Society of Chicago undertook a reconnaissance survey of the wreck site in 1992, and in 1994, the process to list the shipwreck on the National Register of Historic Places began. She was determined eligible in 1999, though Zike objected, and so she's not on the register. That's a legal battle I mentioned earlier. And so if divers want to dive the Lady Elgin, they have to obtain permission from Zike and Lady Elgin Foundation, and they're expected to observe the preservation laws governing historic sites. There are memorials in place to honor the victims of PS Lady Elgin, with a Wisconsin historical marker in the historic 3rd Ward of Milwaukee commemorating the sinking. Calvary Cemetery in Milwaukee has a monument dedicated to the lives lost on Lady Elgin that were buried there. In 1861, songwriter Henry Clay Work penned the memorial song Lost on the Lady Elgin, and for many years in central Canada, this song was sung at family gatherings and social occasions. If you're Canadian, let me know if you've heard of this song, and if it is still or ever was part of your traditions. In 2009, the Milwaukee Irish Heritage and Cultural Center launched a $200,000 fundraising campaign for a huge 2-story bronze memorial statue for the Lady Elgin disaster. I can't find any information if the statue was completed or not. The sinking of PS Lady Elgin was a horrifically sad tragedy filled with chaos, fear, and devastation for all those involved with it. It is important we honor this enormous part of American history that had a lasting effect on the political landscape of the 1860s. Had Lincoln not won in the 1861 presidential election, who knows what America would look like today? Rest in peace to all of the victims of this tragedy. May we never forget. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our Paddle Wheel Steamships playlist in the cards. Next week, we get into the story of Peter Iredale, a sailing ship that was lost on the Oregon coast while heading toward the Columbia River. Thank you for tuning in to Shipwreck Sunday, have a great week, and we'll see you next time.